They say time forgets, but I remember everything. It was the spring of 1942 when I met her. Élise Moreau, a young French nurse with a quiet strength in her eyes and a secret she carried alone across a war-torn landscape. She was returning from the front lines in Tunisia, her uniform stained with the effort of saving lives, enemy and ally alike. But what struck me most wasn't the uniform, nor the war. It was the silence in her gaze, and the way she looked over her shoulder towards something only she could see. I had seen many soldiers fight, many leaders rise, but what I witnessed that day on the dust-choked roads of North Africa was something different. Something that reminded me why we must never let these stories slip through the cracks of history, because behind every headline, every order, and every battle plan, there were people, real people, carrying their pain and hope like hidden medals on their chest. Some memories fade, others live on because they must. This is one of them. Welcome to the channel. If you believe these stories should never be forgotten, join us. Subscribe now and turn on the notifications to help keep every memory and every story alive. Without further delay, let's get straight to the point. The air was dry that afternoon in 1942, and the Tunisian road ahead stretched like a scar across the earth. Dust rose behind the military jeep, its engine tired but determined, much like the woman behind the wheel. Her name was Élise Moreau, a French nurse, serving with the Allied Medical Corps. She was 7 months pregnant, moving slowly, carefully, her every breath steady, with silent courage. Her partner, a Canadian officer, had not returned from a recent operation, but she carried forward, carrying far more than herself. I had arrived in North Africa the day before. My purpose was simple: to see the men and women holding the lines, to remind them that their effort was seen and their sacrifice remembered. War has a way of burying quiet heroism under noise. I refused to let that happen. As I stepped out of the field tent to inspect a convoy post near the edge of a newly secured sector, I saw a commotion unfold. An American military police officer, Stevens, was stationed near the checkpoint. Young, rigid, too quick to act. Elise's jeep had approached slowly, and instead of offering assistance, he barked orders with the sharp edge of suspicion. "Out of the vehicle, now," he demanded, hand resting firmly on his holster. Élise didn't argue. She had seen far too much already to believe that defiance would help. She opened the door and placed a careful foot on the ground, the weight of her condition slowing her movements. But Stevens didn't wait. As she tried to steady herself, he shoved her hard. She stumbled and fell into the dust. No questions, no recognition, just the cold weight of someone who had forgotten the line between discipline and cruelty. I moved quickly. "That woman has done more for this war than you have in your short months here," I said, my voice steady but loud enough for the others to hear. "Pick her up and treat her as an ally, because that's what she is." Stevens froze. The silence that followed said more than any reprimand ever could. He extended a hand, unsure, ashamed. Élise took it, though the pain in her expression lingered. Later that evening, I sat near the field fire with a few medics and infantrymen. The desert cooled quickly after sunset. One of them, a Scottish sergeant named Alistair, lit a pipe and said, "You know, sir, we try to fight the enemy out there, but sometimes the battle sneaks in through other uniforms." He was right, and that day reminded me, not every wound came from across the lines. Some were caused by misunderstanding, by fear, by the slow erosion of humanity under endless pressure. Élise remained calm throughout. When I spoke to her afterward, she didn't mention the fall or the shove. She spoke about the wounded, about the men she had helped, and, though she couldn't reach in time, her focus was never on herself. That, to me, was the mark of someone who had chosen compassion over conflict. In a world where the two constantly collided, it is easy to believe that war is made of noise, fire, and iron. But often it is moments like these, quiet, raw, deeply human, that stay with you. I remember that road. I remember her strength. And I remember the lesson, even in war, dignity must be protected. Always. That was not just a memory. It was a warning and a tribute. The sun pressed down without mercy, casting long shadows across the scorched earth of North Africa. It was 1942, and though the uniforms around us bore the banners of unity, war had a way of exposing every fracture, even among those who fought on the same side. Élise Moreau lay on the ground, her hands clutching the rough gravel beneath her. The impact from earlier still echoed through her body. Dust clung to her skin, and her breathing came in shallow waves. The quiet was unbearable, not because there was no sound, but because in that silence she realized she was truly alone. She was 7 months along, carrying the only part of her late partner that remained. Every step she took since his absence had been an act of survival, of belief that what she carried inside her was a reason to endure. But in that moment, broken, humiliated, her body trembling with pain, even hope began to slip through her fingers. I arrived minutes after the incident, my driver, having taken the longer path to the forward post. The soldiers were silent when I stepped out, faces down, eyes avoiding mine. I didn't need to ask. I could feel it in the air. Something had gone wrong, something no man present had dared to fix. There she was, still on the ground, trying to rise without help. Her expression wasn't one of anger. It was something far worse, quiet resignation. I moved toward her and knelt beside her, lowering my voice. "You shouldn't be here alone." She looked up, slowly. "But I am," she whispered. I called for a medic, and as they checked her, I stood beside her jeep, my hands behind my back, fighting the ache that had settled in my chest. In war, we expect to lose things: men, ground, time. But when we lose our ability to care, even for a moment, we lose far more than we can measure. The baby survived. But Élise would carry the weight of that day in silence. Not because she wanted to forget, but because speaking of it would mean reliving the moment. When trust had nearly shattered her, I spoke with her again a few days later. She told me she had once believed the uniform meant protection, that allied hands would always lift, not push, that a shared cause would always be stronger than fear. But in the dust of Tunisia, she had learned something bitter, that even among the good, there were moments when the light dimmed. And yet, she stayed. She returned to her station, wrapped her pain in quiet strength, and resumed her work tending to the wounded. Her silence was not weakness. It was a shield, and to me, it spoke louder than any words. In the end, not every wound is visible. Not every battle makes noise. Some live quietly in the hearts of those who endured, like Élise, whose courage was forged not on the front lines, but in the stillness after. The summer heat wrapped itself around Tunisia like a cloak, thick and unrelenting. The land stretched out in harsh, golden waves, broken only by scattered outposts and the weary faces of men who hadn't seen peace in months. I was there that day, not as a speechmaker or a name behind a desk, but as a man among soldiers, on a quiet, unannounced visit to the front. We had stopped at a ridge overlooking one of the main supply routes. I raised my binoculars, more out of habit than expectation, scanning the horizon for signs of movement, progress, or trouble. What I saw wasn't the enemy. It was something far more unsettling. A scene unfolding near a small checkpoint, where a jeep had just been stopped. There was a woman, a nurse. I recognized her, Élise Moreau. I had seen her name in reports, heard her spoken of in the mess tents. The men respected her, even admired her. But in that moment, through the glass of my lenses, I saw her being forced from her vehicle. There was no urgency, no clear threat, just the cold, rigid posture of a soldier who had forgotten the difference between duty and cruelty. She fell, not from weakness, but from the careless shove of someone who had let fear and power outweigh judgment. My hands tightened around the binoculars. I didn't say a word, not yet. I simply turned to my escort and gave a quiet order. Get me down there, now. The driver didn't ask questions. Minutes later, I was standing among the dust and silence that followed the incident. Soldiers straightened their backs the moment they saw me. But I wasn't looking for ceremony. I was looking at her, Élise, brushing off her uniform, her face pale but composed. A medic stood nearby, unsure of what to do. The officer who had pushed her, Stevens, stood stiffly, eyes forward, as if hoping to disappear into his own shadow. I stepped between them. When we forget who we are, when we fail to see those beside us as allies and not suspects, we lose something far more dangerous than any ground, I said, my voice steady. We lose each other. No one spoke. The desert wind moved through us like a quiet witness. Élise didn't speak either. She simply nodded and walked back to her vehicle, her posture straighter than ever. That day marked a shift, not just for her or for Stevens, but for all who were present. It reminded us that leadership is not only measured in victories and strategies, but in moments like these, when silence weighs heavier than sound, and a single act of decency can restore what fear tried to take away. I came to Tunisia to observe the battle. What I found was something far more important, a lesson in humanity, quietly written in the bad dust of a forgotten road. Night had fallen over the Tunisian outpost, casting long shadows over tents and weary faces. The sky was clear, but the air was heavy, not with sand or smoke, but with something colder, shame. Word of what had happened to Élise Moreau had spread quietly among the ranks. Some whispered, others avoided eye contact. But no one could deny what had taken place under the same flag they wore over their hearts. That evening, I gathered the officers, not for strategy, not for orders, but because something deeper had fractured, something no map or supply line could mend. The tent was dimly lit, the silence dense. Faces lined with dust and doubt stared back at me, waiting. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I was told the woman pushed to the ground was just a nurse, I began. But she's not just anything. She's a comrade, a caretaker, a symbol of the very compassion we're meant to protect. I paused, watching their expressions harden, not in defiance, but in discomfort, the kind that comes when truth hits where it hurts. I let the silence settle before I continued. Her name is Élise Moreau. She has saved lives that even some of you had already given up on. And yet, on our soil, in our uniform, she was treated not as a hero, but as a threat. Some lowered their eyes. Others clenched their jaws, but no one spoke. Then I said the words that still echo in my mind. How many more times will we allow our soldiers to become both judge and executioner of their own brothers and sisters in arms? No one had an answer, nor did I expect one, because the question wasn't meant to be answered, it was meant to be carried like a weight on every shoulder in that tent, carried as a reminder that war, with all its chaos, cannot excuse the abandonment of decency. I turned to leave, but paused at the entrance. The enemy is not only out there, sometimes it wears our colors, and when it does, we must be braver still, brave enough to hold our own to account. Outside, the desert wind had picked up, stirring the tents and muttering through the canvas like a voice older than all of us. I looked out toward the field hospital, where Élise had returned to her duties without complaint. Her silence said everything. She didn't need to shout. Her resolve did it for her. That night, I saw in the mirror not just a leader, but a man reminded of his duty, not only to lead armies, but to protect the soul of those who served beneath him. In 1942, the war needed more than tactics. It needed truth, and above all, it needed moral courage, the kind that doesn't flinch when looking into its own reflection. The wind outside the field hospital howled like a restless ghost, brushing through the canvas walls and carrying with it the scent of sand, sweat, and something harder to name: memory. Inside, beneath the dim glow of lanterns and the quiet shuffle of nurses moving between beds, Élise Moreau sat alone at the edge of a cot, her hands resting over her rounded stomach. Her uniform was still dusty, her body still aching from the fall days earlier, but the pain that lingered deepest wasn't physical. The hospital stood on the edge of the Tunisian desert, built in haste but held together by grit and human will. Wounded soldiers lay in rows, some whispering through fever, others lost in the haze of exhaustion. Élise moved among them with calm hands and tired eyes, offering comfort where she could, but rarely speaking. The silence became her companion, one that knew too much, one she couldn't send away. That night, as the camp quieted and the distant drums of artillery faded into the horizon, her thoughts drifted back to Lyon, to a time before the uniforms and sirens. She remembered the streets lined with bookstores and cafes, the scent of warm bread in the morning. She remembered her mother's voice, soft and patient, and the piano in the living room no one played anymore. And she remembered him, the Canadian officer who had held her hands on the train station platform before being called away to a place she would never see. There had been a time when she believed that love, even in war, could be a kind of shield. But here, on the margins of a battlefield, surrounded by the quiet suffering of those still breathing, Élise understood something she hadn't before, that the greatest wounds weren't the ones the medics could treat. They were the ones carried behind the eyes, stitched into silence, invisible to all but those who bore them. I visited the hospital that evening, checking on the conditions and speaking with the head surgeon. When I saw Élise, I paused at the doorway. She hadn't noticed me. Her hand moved slowly across her stomach, and her gaze was lost somewhere far away. I didn't interrupt. I simply watched for a moment I've never forgotten. Later, as we passed in the hallway, she looked up and nodded. Just once. A quiet acknowledgement that said far more than words could manage. I returned, the gesture with equal weight, for in her stillness I saw the kind of courage we rarely speak of, the courage to remember, to keep going, and to carry what cannot be left behind. In 1942, battles were fought on maps and across continents, but some of the fiercest struggles took place in hearts like hers, far from headlines, away from medals, in the quiet corridors of memory and grief. And for those like Élise Moreau, the war would never truly end. Because while some scars fade with time, others remain, not to wound but to remind. The heat had softened by the time the proceedings began. It was late 1942, and the air over the Tunisian camp carried a strange stillness, not from calm, but from anticipation. Soldiers gathered quietly near the makeshift tribunal tent, their uniforms marked by months of fatigue, their eyes drawn not to the officer on trial, but to the woman seated near the back, her presence silent yet undeniable. A court-martial is rarely a moment of pride, but this one carried weight beyond the uniform. The case wasn't just about protocol or discipline, it was about dignity, about a line that had been crossed in full view of those who were supposed to stand together. Military Police Officer Stevens sat stiffly under the canvas, the sun streaking through gaps in the fabric above. His face showed no defiance now, only a quiet understanding that the world around him had shifted, not just because of what he had done, but because of who had witnessed it. The testimonies began. First came a British medic who had served beside Élise for 5 months. His voice shook as he described the long nights she'd worked without sleep, the way she refused to leave the side of any man, regardless of his uniform or accent. Then a Canadian infantryman stood. He had been wounded near the Marath line and remembered Élise not for her medical skill, but for the way she had spoken to him, gently in French, as if reminding him that he was more than just another uniform in pain. A French officer followed, eyes wet with restrained emotion. "She is the reason I am still here," he said, "and she never once asked for anything in return." Then, unexpectedly, a German prisoner was brought in. Treated by Élise weeks earlier after a chaotic skirmish, he walked with a limp and held no notes. His English was broken, but his words needed no translation. "She helped me when she could have walked away. She did not see an enemy, only a person." Each voice added another stone to the scale. By the time the final statement was read, even the most hardened commanders shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The truth was no longer a matter of evidence. It had become a chorus, voices from every side of the conflict, speaking not of politics or war, but of the simple acts that made someone worthy of respect. I spoke last, not as Prime Minister, but as someone who had seen what happened, who had walked the dirt road where it all began. "There are moments in war when we are tested in ways that never make headlines," I said. "Moments where our strength is not shown through firepower, but through how we treat those who stand beside us. Élise Moreau has done more to uphold the soul of this army than many of us will ever know." There was no applause, only silence, the kind that speaks volumes in the absence of sound. The ruling was swift. Stevens was stripped of his rank and reassigned to non-combat duties far from the front. It was not revenge. It was accountability, the kind we owe to those who carry burdens without asking for recognition. As the crowd dispersed, Élise stood and quietly walked away. She never asked for this moment, but in her silence, an entire army had found its voice. The afternoon sun filtered through the worn canvas above, casting faint lines of light across the solemn faces in the tribunal tent. Dust floated in the still air, undisturbed, as if even the wind dared not intrude on what was about to unfold. Soldiers from across the Allied forces, French, British, Canadian, American, stood shoulder to shoulder, their expressions heavy with fatigue and expectation. The war raged on beyond the hills, but in this moment all eyes were fixed on the small wooden platform at the front of the room. Winston Churchill stood nearby, not with the authority of command, but with the gravity of someone witnessing something far more enduring than strategy. His hands were clasped behind his back, his eyes fixed forward, quiet and unblinking. He did not speak, he didn't need to. The officer presiding over the court rose and opened a folder with deliberate care. Every rustle of the paper seemed to echo like thunder. "By the authority vested in this tribunal and in accordance with military law," he began, his voice steady, "Military Police Officer Charles Stevens is hereby found guilty of abuse of authority." A wave of silence swept the tent, not one of surprise but of release. The kind that comes when justice, long held in uncertainty, finally finds a voice. "This verdict," the officer continued, "is not simply a response to a single act. It is a reaffirmation that dignity, even in war, must never be seen as optional. That respect, regardless of rank or origin, remains the foundation of this alliance." Stevens stood motionless, pale, eyes low. He had worn the weight of this moment for weeks, but now it had settled completely. His punishment would not involve chains or exile. He would be reassigned, stripped of command, and placed under close supervision, a decision not made out of vengeance, but to set a line that would not be crossed again. Churchill's gaze never left the front. When the verdict was complete, He stepped forward a few quiet paces and spoke in a voice that held both sorrow and resolve. "We fight to protect freedom," he said. "But if we do not defend the freedom within our own ranks, the freedom to walk with dignity, to serve with honor, to be treated as human beings, then what are we fighting for?" No one answered, not the generals, not the soldiers, not Élise, who watched from the back with hands gently folded across her lap. The message had already been heard. That day, in the middle of a war that threatened to drown the world in chaos, a small tent in the desert became a place of reckoning, a place where the lines between right and wrong were drawn not with weapons, but with conscience. And the verdict was more than a punishment. It was a declaration. Even in 1942, even when hope was scarce and cruelty could hide behind orders, humanity would not be surrendered, not without a fight. The year was drawing to a close, and though the winds of war still howled across the deserts of North Africa, something softer had begun to take root, something rare in times like these. The field hospital, once filled with the constant rhythm of urgency, now held a quieter tone. Soldiers spoke in hushed voices, and for the first time in many months, laughter, faint but real, could be heard between the canvas walls. Élise Moreau, whose name had become known not for rank or decoration, but for quiet courage, had brought new life into the world. On a clear December night, under a sky littered with stars, she gave birth to a boy. The nurses wrapped him in a worn military blanket, and those nearby paused as if bearing witness to a miracle. In a world torn apart by conflict, a child had arrived, not in fear, but in peace. They named him Joshua Winston Moreau. Word reached me the next morning. I was still stationed in a nearby command post, reviewing logistics and weather reports. But when I received the news, I asked for a moment of privacy. The war, for all its demands, could wait. I sat alone with pen and paper and I wrote from the heart. "Dear Élise, there are victories that never make the papers and heroes who never hold a weapon. You, I believe, are both. Today, your son bears a name that I will hold with quiet pride, not for what I've done, but for what you have shown us all. May he grow strong as you have been, and may he always know that he was born under a sky that watched over both ruin and rebirth. Yours, in deepest respect, Winston Churchill." I sealed the letter and sent it with an officer I trusted. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the desert in gold, I stood outside the tent and looked up. The same stars had witnessed so much pain, so many losses. But tonight, they also saw something new. Life had found a way to break through the dust. Élise would remain in Tunisia a few more months, caring for soldiers, now with her child close by. She never asked for special treatment. She never wore her pain as a badge. And yet, in the eyes of every soldier who saw her, there was something different now. Not just respect, but reverence. In a place built to heal wounds, a heart had begun to heal too. The war wasn't over, far from it. But Joshua's first cry was a reminder that even in the darkest chapters, something beautiful could be written. And in 1942, under the same sky that had seen so much sorrow, hope bloomed again, in the arms of a nurse, in the name of a child, and in the silent promise that not everything good would be lost to the fire. Years had passed, but time had not softened the weight of 1942 in Winston Churchill's memory. It lived in quiet corners of his mind, not in maps or battle speeches, but in the faces of those who had changed him. And one afternoon in a quiet room in London, those memories returned in the form of a familiar knock. Élise Moreau stepped into his study, her presence unchanged, still composed, still carrying a strength that came not from rank, but from everything she had endured and overcome. She was no longer the young nurse who had walked through sand and silence, but the dignity she carried was just as powerful. Churchill rose slowly from his chair, the years visible in his posture, but not in his eyes. When he saw her, he smiled, not out of formality, but out of something deeper: respect, recognition, gratitude. "You remind me," he said softly, "of what truly mattered out there." They spoke for hours, of the desert, of the child she had raised, of the men and women who had never been named in the history books, but who had shaped the very spirit of the war. She had kept the letter he wrote after Joshua's birth. It was worn from time but intact, a symbol of hope in a world that had nearly forgotten it. As the sky outside turned from grey to gold, Churchill walked her to the door. Before she left, he took her hand and said, "That year changed many things, but above all, it reminded me that even in the darkest times, we must never lose our humanity. You taught me that, and I will never forget." When she was gone, he remained at the window for a long time, watching the clouds drift over the rooftops of a quiet city that had once braced for ruin. He didn't speak. He didn't write. He simply stood there remembering. Some stories don't end in victory or defeat. They live on in the silence that follows, in the bonds that are never broken, and in the choices made when no one is watching. Elise's story, and the story of that year, is not one of fame or glory. It is a story of dignity, of quiet courage, and of the lines that must never be crossed, no matter the chaos around us. It is a reminder that behind every uniform there is a person, and that every person leaves behind a mark in the hearts they touch and in the truths they refuse to let go. Churchill would go on to face many storms, but when asked about the war, he never failed to speak of those moments, the small ones, the human ones, the kind that shaped the very soul of a nation. And perhaps that is the true legacy of 1942, not just what was fought for, but what was preserved. Honor, compassion, and the belief that even one voice, calm, steady, and true, can shift the course of history. Did you already know this story? What would you have done in her place? What other stories about soldiers and veterans should be told? If this story moved you, don't let it be forgotten. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to hear more stories like this one. We'll meet again soon with another memory that must never fade.